Hi, everyone. We're so glad to welcome you to our session on building equitable homeless systems. Thank you for being with us. My name is Aras Juzan. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm based in Los Angeles, the native land of the Tongva people. And I have the privilege of being the data and technology lead for Community Solutions. I'll pass it to my colleague, Romina, who's joining me today.
Hi, my name is Romina Davidson, and I take all pronouns, and I'm located in Brooklyn, New York, the native land of the Munsee Lenape people, and I'm on the Zero for All team at Community Solutions.
Community Solutions is an organization working towards a lasting end to homelessness that leaves no one behind. And as part of that work, Romina and I have the privilege of working with almost 100 cities and counties across the United States as part of an initiative called Built for Zero. Collectively, over the last few years, these communities have served over 100,000 individuals experiencing homelessness to safely and stably resolve their experience of homelessness. 14 of them have ended homelessness for one or more populations. 61 of them have achieved quality real-time data, and over 40 have achieved a measurable reduction for one or more populations experiencing homelessness. One of the fundamental pillars of our work is supporting communities to build local, real-time, person-specific data systems, often referred to as by-name lists or by-name data sources that they use to track meaningful progress towards an end to homelessness that we call functional zero. What that looks like in terms of our support is helping folks visualize, analyze, and try and drive improvements like the chart that we're looking at right now, where hopefully they're able to see reductions in homelessness month over month as they sort of test new ideas and keep their eye on the data to understand what's working and what's not working. The work is heavily rooted in measurement and also in the idea that clear definitions for success are crucial for our work. Up until recently, however, this type of work for our team hasn't involved explicit and state measures around racial equity in homeless response systems in the communities that we're supporting. So I'll pass it over to Romina to talk a little bit about a recent mind shift for our team and some of the reasons behind it.
Yeah, so thanks, Aras. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the SPARK study from the C4SI, who are actually our partners in this work to promote racial equitable homelessness systems. And this data is from the American context, but I think there are some similar studies in the Canadian context that essentially show that race is a root cause of homelessness. So as you can see in the bullets here, and we can share this study too for folks who are interested, but although Black people comprise 13% of the general population of the United States and 26% of those living in poverty, they account for more than 40% of the homeless population, suggesting that poverty rates alone do not explain the overrepresentation. Similarly, American Indians and Alaskan Natives comprise 0.6% of the general population and 1.6% of those living in deep poverty, yet account for 2.5% of the homeless population. And as you can see through the other bullets, people of color were consistently underrepresented in leadership positions in homeless service provider and continuums of care. And the SPARK research didn't show overrepresentation of other racial/ethnic groups, such as Hispanic or Asian, but researchers suspect this may be due to data quality issues. So viewing that kind of data, one of the methods that we're using to try to create equitable homelessness systems is focusing on what's called targeted universalism. So targeted universalism is outcome-oriented, and the processes are directed in service of the explicit universal goal. So in our case, it would be to end homelessness, right? And targeted universalism also seeks the development of a range of implementation strategies tailored to address both the structures that impede different groups and populations, and to affirmatively develop structures that promote the desired outcomes for different populations. So this would involve targeted solutions for particular groups in order to meet a universal outcome. In this case would be ending homelessness. So as you can see in this picture here, one of the interesting examples, I think, of targeted universalism is the curb cut example in Berkeley, California. And we can actually provide some information on that, where Disability advocates actually pushed for curb cuts so that wheelchairs could access sidewalks and go through streets. But when Berkeley was able to actually do this in order to make these sidewalks and streets more accessible, it created an environment where other folks could also access streets and sidewalks more easily, like bikes, strollers. And so everybody kind of benefited from this targeted approach. Targeted universalism generally as a practice involves 5 steps. So the first is to establish a universal goal based upon a broadly shared recognition of the societal problem and collective aspirations. Here would be, right, the ending of homelessness for everybody. Right? The second step is to assess general population performance relative to the universal goal. The third would be to identify groups and places that are performing differently with respect to the goal. And groups should be disaggregated by population for us in this case. And the fourth would be to assess and understand the structures that support or impede each group or community from achieving the universal goal. And the fifth would be to develop and implement targeted strategies for each group to reach the universal goal. All right. So with all of that in mind, we can start to talk a little bit about the actual framework that we developed to create racially equitable homelessness systems. So I'll take you through a little bit of the process. Okay, great. So one of the questions we had, right, was why develop actual indicators to measure racial equity in a homelessness system? So we heard from folks, and we spent a lot of time listening, right, to communities and people in that about what exactly should be measuring and what we should do. And what we heard was that a lot of the current U.S. outcome measures for ending homelessness don't actually include any measures for equity. We talk about it a lot, but we don't see a lot of folks actually measuring what that means. And we heard from folks that it's really important to have concrete measurable aims like we do in the concept of functional zero. We also heard about a lot of the challenges in understanding and communicating whether we're making progress towards aims like equity, and that it's hard to know, whether we're actually making changes that result in improvement if we don't have anything to measure. We also weren't sure how to hold the system and each other accountable for improvements that would lead towards equity. Okay, so this slide goes over a little bit of the timeline of the process that we used to create the indicator. So we started to really think about, at Community Solutions Built for Zero, we started to really think about race equity in the Tulsa conference that we had, the learning session in 2016. So it's actually taken us some time to put out a racially equitable framework. We did a lot of learning, so we wanted to put out something that we could really stand behind. In 2018, so the Spark research that I went over came out, and it was presented at our learning session. We started to think about this kind of work about how to do racial equity. We had team-wide brainstorms, we had a data pilot, we started to consult with equity leaders in the field to really start to learn into how to actually do this work. In 2019, we had multiple org-wide racial equity trainings. We had a first draft of the racial equity strategy come out, and a first draft of actually the racially equitable measurement framework come out too. And in the next year, we started to really fine-tune that work, actually. So we had a facilitation for racial justice training. We started to work really get into equity-specific strategic plans that our board approved, so that's internal and external. And then we got hit with the pandemic, but it actually just put into further contrast for us, right, why this work was so important. That's what the pandemic really did. Rather than slow us down, it made it more clear why this was so important to do. And I can go into, I think the next slide starts to get into a little bit more about so the feedback collection process we took. So when we actually created that first draft or the indicators, we did a really in-depth kind of feedback collection process on those indicators so that we could come out with the best framework possible. So we had 100% of the Built for Zero team take a look at the framework and make comments and edits. We did 4 community focus groups that really went into our communities that we worked with to get their feedback on what made sense to them locally. We also talked to 11 external partners who are some of which are listed here to get their take. And we had held 3 focus groups of people with lived experience of homelessness, facilitated by our team, in Phoenix, Detroit, and Washington, D.C. to collect feedback, especially from folks, right, who are affected by homelessness systems, what would be most important to them to hear and to see in a framework like this. And with that, I will pass it back to Ross.
Thanks, Romina. So as Romina described, ultimately, the culmination of all of this robust conversation, learning, and feedback was a racial equity indicators framework that I'll show you in just a moment. But before I do that, I wanted to frame up the broader context into which our team decided to deploy this framework. So it's great to have a framework or some end state measures that say, here's what good looks like, but they're only really as meaningful as the context and framing in which I think those measures are going to be used. And so for us, for a long time, when we were working with communities around measurable reductions and an end to homelessness, we talked about the importance of quality data. And then we leveraged a set of definitions related to system outcomes, right? How would we sort of know if a community had made tangible progress? We would look at some system outcomes and we would first make sure that we felt like the quality data was in place to be able to have confidence in those outcomes. And what we've started to do is socialize and talk about this triangle of measures, adding these racial equity indicators as co-equal parts of the puzzle for communities working to end homelessness. So it's not disconnected, right? And I think as Romina mentioned earlier in the sort of literature review or the research that we dug into as a first step in our work, knowing that one of the root causes in the United States of housing insecurity and homelessness is structural racism means that we need to push these homeless response systems to be explicitly thinking about equity in service of ending homelessness. If we don't do it, we're not going to see the kind of progress and system transformation that we think lies at the core of the mission for all of us in this work. And so because of that, it felt really important to start to even just build the communication muscle to say these things are inextricably linked, that it wouldn't be enough for a community to say we have quality data and system outcomes, but we never break that data out by race and ethnicity, that we all need to go further to make sure that our systems are leaving nobody behind. And so in service of that, we started to take these quantitative outcome definitions, and what we're looking at right now are some of the sort of specific measures used to define functional zero or an end to homelessness in a community, and to layer on these 4 equity indicators. And I want to spend the rest of the session talking through these with you and having a good discussion about these. So the 4 indicators of a racially equitable system that we developed in conjunction with folks with lived experience of homelessness, leaders in the field, as well as partners, are equitable system decision-making power, equitable feedback from end users of the system or lived experience of end users of the system, ensuring that there's equitable data quality, that data quality is sufficient to be able to then look at equity and system outcomes. And specifically, I want to name 3 system outcome measures that we really want communities to hone in on. Those are disproportionality in housing placements or sort of resource allocation, disproportionality in average length of time from identification or first touch to the homeless response system and housing, as well as disproportionality in returns to homelessness from housing. So those 3 areas came up time and again as we were in conversation with community leaders and folks with lived experience as being indicative of gaps in equity around homeless response systems. And so we wanted to focus in on those metrics specifically, even though we know there are lots of other indicators that might be meaningful too. This, I should say, is by no means an exhaustive list. We don't think that this is a definition of what a perfect system looks like, but we do think that a good system needs to be one that is focused on equity on at least these 4 domains. And we're eager to start to dig in and learn with the field and with partners like all of you around what is working and what's not and what might be missing in this framework. And so those are really our next steps. We're working to develop some tools for communities to start to assess baselines across these 4 indicators to understand potential areas for improvement and to have productive and sometimes challenging conversations with stakeholders and their geographies around how to start to make meaningful progress or where there might be disparities that we need to stay attuned to. Next, we're going to be supporting learning and targeted improvement efforts around these end state indicators, and we're excited to start to document and share that learning as it comes up. One thing that I know as somebody who has been involved in the work that Ramina outlined in that timeline over the last 5 years is that there are so much deep expertise in the field, and that there are so many leaders who have been at this work longer than I have, longer than Ramina has. And so my hope is that now we can pivot not just to questions from all of you, but also to discussion. How has your community thought about equity when it comes to its homeless response system? How should we be thinking about measuring equity in these systems? What's resonating for you around those 4 indicators, and what feels missing? We would love to be in conversation with you. Thank you so much.